He thought it was just another ordinary tip, a few dollars slipped into his palm after a day's work. But when the concierge glanced down at the name scrawled on the check, his breath caught in his throat, and in that instant, his whole world cracked open. I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're sweeping a lobby, checking surveillance cameras, or turning the final locks for the night. It doesn't matter what hour finds you. But I promise you, today's story will reach into your chest and squeeze your heart until you remember what it feels like to be truly seen. The marble floors of the Meridian Tower in downtown Chicago gleam under crystal chandeliers that cast rainbow fragments across walls lined with imported Italian stone. Here, in this cathedral of commerce and wealth, fortunes built on stock market investments and cryptocurrency portfolios move like ghosts through hallways that smell of expensive leather and fresh orchids. The elevator banks rise 43 floors into the gray Chicago sky, carrying passengers whose net worth exceeds the annual budgets of small towns. This is where old money meets new tech, where Bitcoin millionaires shake hands with oil barons, where the rustle of designer suits mingles with the soft chime of golden elevator doors. And in the heart of this financial fortress stands James Reynolds, 62 years old, wearing his concierge uniform like a soldier's dress blues. Crisp navy blazer with brass buttons, pressed white shirt, burgundy tie knotted with military precision. His weathered hands, scarred from years of maintenance work before this promotion to the front desk, rest gently on the polished granite counter. Behind wire-rimmed glasses, his gray eyes hold the accumulated wisdom of 3 decades spent watching, listening, remembering. James doesn't simply work in this building. He is its memory, its conscience, its invisible guardian. The residents flow past him like water around a stone. Mrs. Pemberton, heir to a pharmaceutical fortune, clicks across the lobby in $1,000 heels, her Hermes bag worth more than James's annual salary. She nods curtly when he holds the elevator, but her eyes never quite meet his. He exists in her peripheral vision, a necessary function rather than a human being. Behind her comes Timothy Blackwood, a hedge fund prince whose Bitcoin investments alone could purchase a small island, scrolling through his phone as he barks orders to his assistant about dividend payments and portfolio adjustments. James knows their routines better than they know themselves. Mrs. Pemberton receives white roses every Tuesday from a florist on Michigan Avenue, gilt flowers from her son who hasn't visited in 8 months. Mr. Blackwood's wife calls the front desk every Friday evening to confirm his location, her voice tight with suspicion that money cannot cure. The judge on the 37th floor orders the same Chinese takeout every Sunday, eating alone while classical music drifts through his slightly open door. James files these details away like a librarian cataloging books no one else bothers to read. His own apartment waits in Pilsen, a neighborhood where the smell of fresh tortillas competes with the industrial tang of the Chicago River. 3 rooms, clean but modest, where he lives alone with photographs of his late wife Maria and their daughter Sophia, now married and living in Phoenix with grandchildren James sees twice a year. The walls are painted a warm yellow that Maria chose 20 years ago, and he has never changed it. Some things are too precious to alter. His kitchen table holds neat stacks of library books, mysteries mostly, and a small notebook where he records his daily observations. Not gossip, but patterns, inconsistencies, the small truths that reveal larger deceptions. Every morning at 5:15, James's alarm clock rattles him from dreams of his younger self when his back was straight and his hopes stretched higher than these glass towers. He showers with the methodical care of a man who understands that dignity begins with personal presentation, dresses in his uniform with the precision of a West Point cadet, and walks 6 blocks to the Red Line station. The train carries him through the awakening city, past windows where other early risers prepare for their own invisible labors, security guards, cleaning crews, the army of workers who make the city function while the wealthy sleep. The Meridian Tower lobby comes alive at 7 sharp. James unlocks the brass doors, disarms the security system with codes he memorized on his second day, and begins the ritual that has defined his last 8 years. He checks the overnight logs, reviews the delivery schedule, ensures the coffee station is stocked with imported beans that cost more per pound than most people spend on groceries. By 7:30, the morning symphony begins. Elevator chimes, footsteps on marble, the rustle of financial newspapers announcing the fortunes won and lost overnight in markets spanning the globe. "Good morning, Mr. Reynolds," calls Sarah Chen, one of the few residents who bothers with his name. A tech entrepreneur who sold her startup for cryptocurrency that appreciated into hundreds of millions, she still remembers what it feels like to be overlooked. Her smile reaches her eyes, and she always asks about his weekend plans, genuinely listening to his answers. In this tower of calculated indifference, her kindness glows like a candle in a cathedral. But for every Sarah Chen, there are 10 others who see James as furniture with a heartbeat. Marcus Feldman, a real estate mogul whose properties stretch across 3 states, snaps his fingers when he wants attention, never using James's name, calling him Doorman or simply you. Last Tuesday, when James handed him a package marked urgent, Feldman snatched it without acknowledgement, as if James were a malfunctioning vending machine that had finally dispensed his selection. The building management company, Pinnacle Properties, views James as a line item in their operational budget, a necessary expense like electricity or insurance. His supervisor, Patricia Wong, visits monthly with a clipboard and disapproving frown, scrutinizing his work for flaws while ignoring his perfect attendance record and the dozen thank you letters tucked in his personnel file. She speaks to him in the clipped tone reserved for children and subordinates, her voice carrying the implicit threat that his position, like his entire existence, remains conditional on her satisfaction. James absorbs these daily humiliations like a sponge soaking up spilled wine. His face remains pleasant, his voice steady, his service impeccable. Behind his professional mask, however, his mind works like a detective's, cataloging inconsistencies, noting whose stories don't align, remembering who was where when things went missing or wrong. He has learned that invisible people see everything precisely because no one bothers to hide from them. Secrets unfold in front of him like flowers blooming in time-lapse photography. Affairs conducted through whispered phone calls, financial schemes discussed in supposedly empty elevators, family dramas played out in marble corridors where the echoes carry every word. 3 months ago, James began noticing irregularities in the building's financial operations. Delivery receipts that didn't match invoices, repair bills for work that was never completed, insurance claims filed for damage that never occurred. Petty crimes, perhaps, pocket change for people whose investment portfolios generated more interest in a day than James earned in a month. But patterns emerged, and James, with his methodical mind trained by years of watching, began to suspect that these small thefts were symptoms of something much larger. The revelation came on a Tuesday evening in late October as autumn painted Chicago's skyline in shades of gold and crimson. James was completing his final security rounds when he discovered the door to the building's financial office slightly ajar. Through the gap, he could see Marcus Feldman hunched over Patricia Wong's desk, photographing documents with his phone, documents that, according to the schedule on James's clipboard, shouldn't exist until next month's audit. James retreated silently, his heart hammering against his ribs like a bird trapped in a cage. For 40 years, he had witnessed the casual cruelty of power, the way wealth insulated people from consequences. But this was different. This was theft on a scale that would devastate the building's modest reserve fund, money earmarked for emergency repairs and capital improvements. Money that ultimately came from the pockets of residents who trusted the management company to act in their interests. That night, James sat at his yellow kitchen table until dawn approached, wrestling with a moral calculus that had no clean solution. Speaking up meant risking everything: his job, his reputation, his carefully constructed life. Remaining silent meant becoming complicit in a crime that would harm innocent people. As the first pale light crept through his windows, illuminating Maria's photograph and the small crucifix she had given him on their wedding day, James made his choice. The next morning, he arrived at work 30 minutes early and copied the security footage from the previous evening onto a small digital drive he kept for backing up family photos. The camera positioned above the financial office door had captured everything: Feldman's late-night visit, his methodical photography of confidential documents, his careful restoration of the scene before departing. James tucked the drive into his uniform pocket and went about his duties as if nothing had changed. But inside, his pulse quickened with the weight of dangerous knowledge. For 3 weeks, James carried this secret like a stone in his chest. He watched Feldman stride through the lobby each morning, impeccably dressed and radiating the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. He observed Patricia Wong's increasingly frequent visits, her anxiety masked as professional diligence, but betrayed by the tremor in her hands when she thought no one was looking. The building's financial irregularities grew more brazen: phantom consulting fees, inflated maintenance contracts, mysterious capital expenditures that existed only on paper. James knew he possessed evidence that could unravel this conspiracy, but he also understood the rules of a game where money trumped justice more often than not. Feldman's wealth, built from real estate investments and stock market manipulations, afforded him legal representation that could twist facts into fiction. Patricia Wong's position gave her credibility that James's word alone could never challenge. In this tower built from accumulated fortunes and inherited privilege, the testimony of a 62-year-old concierge carried less weight than the morning's newspaper. As November's chill settled over Chicago, transforming the lake into a sheet of hammered pewter, James began to plan his next move with the patience of a chess master contemplating a complex endgame. He knew that truth alone was insufficient. He needed allies, corroboration, a strategy that would protect him from the inevitable retaliation. For perhaps the first time in his life, James Reynolds, invisible guardian of the Meridian Tower, prepared to step from the shadows and claim his voice. The trap snapped shut on a Wednesday morning when James arrived to find his security access revoked and a termination letter waiting on the concierge desk. No explanation. No opportunity for defense. Just a crisp document on Pinnacle Properties letterhead informing him that his services were no longer required, effective immediately. Patricia Wong appeared within minutes, her face a mask of professional regret that fooled no one. "I'm sorry, James," she said, her voice carrying all the warmth of a recorded message. "There have been some concerns about security protocols. Nothing personal, you understand. We'll provide positive references, naturally." Behind her stood Marcus Feldman, his presence no coincidence. He examined his manicured nails with studied indifference while James cleared his personal belongings from the desk he had occupied for 8 years. A coffee mug Sophia had given him for Father's Day. A small picture of Maria taken during their honeymoon in Wisconsin dells. A wooden cross blessed by the priest at St. Adelbor's, where James attended Sunday Mass with the devotion of someone who understood that faith and justice were inseparable concepts. "Security will escort you out," Patricia continued, avoiding James's steady gaze. "Standard procedure, nothing personal." But it was personal, deeply personal, and everyone in that gleaming lobby knew it. James had seen too much, remembered too well, posed a threat that money and influence could eliminate only by removing him entirely. As he walked toward the brass doors he had opened thousands of times, James felt the weight of 40 years' worth of invisible labor, of dignity maintained despite countless small humiliations, of a life spent in service to people who barely acknowledged his humanity. The November wind struck his face like a slap as he emerged onto LaSalle Street, carrying his few possessions in a cardboard box that seemed to mock the grandeur he was leaving behind. Around him, Chicago pulsed with its eternal rhythm, buses grinding through their routes, pedestrians hurrying toward whatever urgent appointments consumed their days, the eternal dance of commerce and ambition that never pauses for one man's private catastrophe. James walked 6 blocks to the Red Line station, where the weekly commuters who had shared his morning ritual for nearly a decade now looked through him as if he had already faded from existence. The train carried him back to Pilsen through neighborhoods where other invisible workers began their own daily struggles, past windows where life continued unchanged by his personal earthquake. By the time he reached his apartment, the yellow walls that had once conveyed warmth now seemed to press inward like the walls of a cell. That evening, James sat at his kitchen table with the digital drive containing security footage that could expose the conspiracy that had cost him his job. For hours he stared at the small device, while shadows lengthened across his floor and the sounds of his neighbors, families preparing dinner, children practicing piano, couples arguing about money, reminded him that life persisted even when individual worlds collapsed. The choice before him was stark. He could take his evidence to the authorities, risk further retaliation, potentially spend his savings on legal battles he might not win. Or he could accept his fate, file for unemployment benefits, search for another position where his age and limited computer skills would work against him in a job market that prized youth and technological fluency above experience and character. But as darkness fell over Chicago and the lights of the downtown towers began to twinkle like stars, James opened his notebook and reviewed the observations he had recorded over 8 years of careful watching. The patterns were undeniable. The theft was massive. The victims, residents who trusted their building's management, employees whose pension funds were being raided, contractors who were billing for non-existent work, deserved protection from predators who wore expensive suits and lived in glass towers above the law. James Reynolds, invisible concierge, made his choice. Not for revenge, but for justice. Not from anger, but from the quiet conviction that some wrongs demanded witnesses brave enough to speak their truth, regardless of the personal cost. He plugged the drive into his laptop computer, a gift from Sophia 2 Christmases ago, and began composing an email that would change more lives than he could possibly imagine. The law office of Ramirez and Associates occupied the 3rd floor of a converted warehouse in Little Village, where the smell of fresh coffee from the cafe below mixed with the industrial aroma of a neighborhood that remembered when Chicago's factories employed armies of workers whose hands built the foundation of American prosperity. James had found the firm through his parish priest, Father Miguel, who knew families throughout the Latino community who had fought their own battles against powerful adversaries, armed with expensive lawyers and unlimited resources. Elena Ramirez, 45 years old, with prematurely gray hair and eyes that had seen too much injustice, listened to James's story while autumn rain drummed against windows that overlooked a playground where children splashed through puddles despite their mother's warnings. She reviewed his evidence with the methodical attention of someone who understood that cases against the wealthy required absolute precision. One missed detail, one procedural error, could unravel months of careful preparation. "You realize what you're up against," she said, her voice carrying the weight of previous battles fought and sometimes lost. "Feldman has connections throughout the city. His real estate portfolio includes properties owned by judges, prosecutors, city council members. His investment firm manages pension funds for half the police department. This isn't just about stolen money. It's about challenging a system designed to protect people like him." James nodded, his calloused hands folded in his lap like a penitent seeking absolution. "I understand. But I've spent my whole life watching rich people get away with things because no one wanted to make trouble. My wife, God rest her soul, she used to say that evil triumphs when good people decide that standing up isn't worth the risk." Elena studied the security footage on her laptop screen, watching Marcus Feldman photograph documents in Patricia Wong's office while the timestamp recorded his crimes with digital precision. "This is solid evidence," she admitted, "but they'll attack your credibility, your motivations. They'll claim you fabricated this footage, that you're a disgruntled employee seeking revenge. The media will portray you as a man who couldn't handle losing his job." "Maybe," James replied, "but the footage doesn't lie. The financial records don't lie. And there are others. Sarah Chen. Some of the newer residents who've noticed irregularities, they're not all deaf and blind to what's happening in their own building." Over the following weeks, Elena Ramirez and her small team of investigators began unraveling a conspiracy that stretched far beyond the Meridian Tower. Feldman's real estate empire was built on a foundation of fraudulent loans, inflated appraisals, and phantom properties that existed only in computer databases. His investment firm had been systematically looting client accounts to fund his expanding portfolio of luxury properties and cryptocurrency speculation. Patricia Wong was merely his inside agent, providing access to financial records that allowed him to identify and exploit vulnerable assets. The scheme had generated millions in illicit profits, money that flowed through shell companies registered in Delaware and offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. Feldman's legal team, led by a white shoe firm that charged $1,000 per hour for their services, had constructed a labyrinth of contracts and corporations designed to obscure the paper trail and provide plausible deniability for their clients' criminal activities. But they had not counted on James Reynolds, invisible concierge, whose 8 years of patient observation had given him an understanding of the building's operations that no forensic accountant could replicate. His detailed logs, maintained in his careful handwriting, documented irregularities that even the most sophisticated money laundering operation could not completely hide. His testimony, corroborated by security footage and financial records, painted a picture of systematic theft that no amount of legal maneuvering could obscure. The first major break came in January, when Sarah Chen agreed to testify about suspicious activities she had witnessed during her daily interactions with building management. Her tech background gave her credibility with investigators who might have dismissed James's concerns, and her willingness to challenge Feldman, despite potential business reputations, demonstrated that not all wealthy residents were complicit in the conspiracy. "I've made my fortune from cryptocurrency investments and stock market speculation," Sarah told Elena during a deposition recorded in the lawyer's cramped conference room. "I understand the temptations that come with managing other people's money. But this goes beyond temptation. This is organized theft disguised as property management." Other residents began coming forward as news of the investigation leaked through the building's informal networks. The judge on the 37th floor provided financial records that documented unauthorized charges to his account. Mrs. Pemberton, initially reluctant to become involved, eventually testified about phantom repair work that was billed but never completed. Even some of Feldman's business associates, concerned about their own legal exposure, began cooperating with investigators. Through it all, James maintained the same quiet dignity that had defined his years of service. He answered attorneys' questions with precise detail, never embellishing, never seeking the spotlight, simply telling the truth as he had observed it. His credibility, built through decades of honest labor and consistent character, proved more valuable than any high-priced legal strategy. The media attention was inevitable and unwelcome. Reporters gathered outside James's apartment building in Pilsen, shouting questions about his motivations and trying to manufacture controversy where none existed. Television crews filmed the Meridian Tower's elegant lobby, while commentators speculated about the scope of the financial conspiracy. James declined all interviews, preferring to let his testimony speak for itself. "I'm not looking for attention," he told Elena during one of their preparation sessions. "I just want people to know that stealing is stealing, whether you do it with a gun or a computer. The amount doesn't matter, the victim doesn't matter. Wrong is wrong, and someone needs to be willing to say so." The trial, when it finally began in late spring, attracted national attention as a symbol of the growing divide between wealthy predators and ordinary citizens seeking justice. Feldman's legal team, as Elena had predicted, attacked James's credibility and motivations, portraying him as a bitter man seeking revenge against former employers. They hired expert witnesses who testified about the unreliability of security footage and the possibility of digital manipulation. But the evidence was overwhelming, and James's truthful testimony, delivered in his steady voice while family members of other victims filled the courtroom gallery, proved unshakable. The jury, composed of 12 ordinary citizens from neighborhoods across Chicago, understood the fundamental injustice of wealthy criminals exploiting their positions to steal from people who trusted them. The verdicts came on a humid Thursday in July. Guilty on all charges. Conspiracy to commit fraud, theft of property, racketeering, money laundering. Marcus Feldman, real estate mogul and Bitcoin millionaire, was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Patricia Wong received 8 years for her cooperation in the scheme. The judge, in pronouncing sentence, specifically recognized James's courage in coming forward, despite the personal risks involved. "Mr. Reynolds," the judge said, looking directly at James in the gallery, "your willingness to speak truth to power represents the best traditions of civic responsibility. This community owes you a debt of gratitude that no monetary compensation can fully repay." But the most meaningful recognition came 3 months later, when the board of directors of the Meridian Tower offered James a position as head of security and resident services, at a salary nearly double what he had earned as a concierge. The offer came with a formal apology for his wrongful termination and a commitment to implement transparency measures that would prevent similar abuses in the future. James accepted the position, but insisted on one condition: that the building establish a fund to assist employees who faced retaliation for reporting wrongdoing. No one should have to choose between their job and their conscience, he told the board. People who work in service positions see everything, but they need to know they'll be protected when they speak up. The yellow walls of James's apartment in Pilsen still hold Maria's warmth, but now they also reflect a quiet satisfaction that comes from standing up when it mattered most. The photographs of his wife and daughter remain on the kitchen table, surrounded by thank you letters from residents who learned to see their concierge not as invisible furniture, but as a guardian whose vigilance protected them from predators who wore expensive suits and lived in glass towers. Sarah Chen visits occasionally, usually bringing coffee from the expensive shop near the Meridian Tower, and conversation about the technology investments that continue to multiply her cryptocurrency fortune. She and James have developed an unlikely friendship built on mutual respect and shared understanding that dignity doesn't depend on net worth or social position. "You changed more than just building policy," she told him during their most recent chat. "You reminded everyone that character matters more than capital, that integrity can't be purchased with investment portfolios or stock market manipulation." James still takes the Red Line downtown each morning, but now he rides with the quiet confidence of someone whose voice was heard when it mattered most. The uniform remains the same: pressed navy blazer, white shirt, burgundy tie knotted with military precision. But the man wearing it walks taller, speaks with greater authority, commands respect from residents who once treated him as part of the building's wallpaper. The Meridian Tower lobby still gleams under crystal chandeliers, still attracts wealthy residents whose fortunes span real estate empires and cryptocurrency speculation. But the atmosphere has changed, softened by the knowledge that justice sometimes emerges from unexpected places, spoken by voices that power had tried to silence. Mrs. Pemberton now stops to ask about James's grandchildren, genuinely interested in his family news. The new building manager, hired after extensive background checks, consults with James on security policies and treats him as a valued colleague rather than a subordinate. Even some of Feldman's former associates, chastened by his downfall, have learned to interact with service workers with something approaching humility. On quiet Sunday evenings when the lobby empties and the elevator banks fall silent, James sometimes reflects on the chain of events that transformed his life from invisible servitude to visible leadership. A small digital drive containing security footage, a decision to speak truth despite personal risk, a legal system that occasionally rewards justice over wealth, a community that rallied around principles more valuable than profit margins. The notebook where James records his daily observations still sits on his kitchen table, but now it contains positive entries about residents who treat staff with respect, building improvements that actually benefit tenants, and policies designed to prevent the kind of exploitation that once thrived in shadow corners where invisible people worked without recognition or protection. Every job has dignity, James often says to younger employees who join the building's security team. Every person deserves respect. Every wrong deserves a witness willing to speak up when it matters. Money and power are temporary things, but integrity lasts forever. Remember that when someone tries to make you feel invisible. The story of James Reynolds spread through the networks of service workers throughout Chicago, building supers, security guards, maintenance crews, all the invisible people who keep the city functioning while wealthy residents pursue their own concerns. His example inspired others to report suspicious activities, to refuse complicity in schemes that exploited their positions, to understand that their observations and testimony could challenge corruption regardless of their social status. Father Miguel still mentions James in his Sunday homilies, using his story to illustrate the gospel teaching that the last shall be first, that God lifts up the humble while powerful predators face judgment for their crimes. The parish has established a legal defense fund to assist community members who face retaliation for reporting wrongdoing, inspired by James's courage and supported by contributions from people who understand that justice requires ordinary citizens willing to take extraordinary risks. As winter approaches Chicago once again, painting the lake in shades of steel and pewter, James Reynolds continues his daily routine with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose life has been vindicated by events he set in motion. The morning commute on the Red Line still carries him through neighborhoods where other invisible workers begin their important labors. But now he rides with the confidence of someone whose voice was heard when it mattered most. The wages of his new position have allowed him to make improvements to his modest apartment, a new refrigerator to replace the one that had been failing for months, better insulation for the windows that face the Chicago wind, a comfortable chair where he can read the mystery novels that still occupy his evening hours. But the most valuable changes are intangible: the respect of colleagues who seek his advice, the gratitude of residents who appreciate his protection, the knowledge that his years of patient observation finally produced justice for people who had no other advocate. The ripple effects of James's courage continued to spread throughout Chicago's network of service workers and beyond. 3 months after the trial concluded, he received a phone call that would change his understanding of his impact even further. The voice on the other end belonged to Maria Santos, a cleaning woman who had worked the night shift at a downtown law firm for 6 years, invisible to the attorneys who stayed late preparing cases worth millions of dollars. "Mr. Reynolds," Maria said, her voice trembling with emotion, "I saw your story on the news. I have information about my bosses. They're stealing money from their clients' settlement funds, using fake receipts and phantom expenses. But I'm scared. I'm a single mother. I have no legal status. They could destroy my life with one phone call." James listened with the patience that had defined his years of service, understanding immediately that Maria faced challenges even greater than his own had been. An undocumented worker possessed even less protection than a 62-year-old concierge, even less credibility in a system designed to favor wealth and power over truth and justice. You don't have to fight this alone," James told her. "There are people who can help, lawyers who understand what you're facing, and there are protections, whistleblower laws that shield people who report crimes, regardless of their immigration status." Over the following weeks, James connected Maria with Elena Ramirez, who had expanded her practice to focus on cases involving exploitation of service workers. The evidence Maria provided, photographs of falsified documents, recordings of conversations about fraudulent billing practices, detailed logs of suspicious financial activities, revealed a pattern of theft that had siphoned millions from injury victims who trusted their attorneys to act in their interests. The case became another victory for justice, another demonstration that invisible workers could challenge powerful predators when they found the courage to speak and the support to sustain their testimony. Maria Santos, documented through whistleblower protections and eventually granted permanent residency, became the second prominent example of how ordinary people could topple corrupt systems simply by refusing to remain silent about the crimes they witnessed. But James's influence extended beyond individual cases of corruption and theft. The Building Industry Association in Chicago, shaken by the revelations about Pinnacle Properties and similar companies, implemented new transparency requirements for management firms. Background checks became mandatory for executives handling resident funds. Financial audits increased in frequency and scope. Most importantly, they established anonymous reporting systems that allowed service workers to report suspicious activities without fear of immediate retaliation. The changes weren't perfect. Money still bought influence, wealth still provided protection, power still attempted to silence uncomfortable voices. But the landscape had shifted, creating space for truth that hadn't existed before James Reynolds decided that his job security mattered less than his moral obligations. On a cold February morning, as James prepared for another day at the Meridian Tower, his phone rang with a call that brought tears to his eyes. Sophia, his daughter in Phoenix, had something important to tell him. "Dad, I've been thinking about what you did, about the courage it took to speak up when you could have just kept quiet and protected yourself. Miguel, you remember my son Miguel? He's been having problems at his school. The principal has been stealing from the fundraising accounts, money that was supposed to buy computers and books for the kids." James felt his heart swell with pride and concern as Sophia continued. "Miguel came to me last week with evidence. He's on the student council, he has access to the financial records, he's seen the fake receipts and inflated bills. But he's scared. He's just 17, Dad. He doesn't know if anyone will believe him, doesn't know if it's worth the trouble." "What did you tell him?" James asked, although he suspected he already knew the answer. "I told him about his grandfather," Sophia said, her voice filled with warmth. "I told him that sometimes ordinary people have to do extraordinary things, that integrity matters more than convenience, that his grandfather taught us that standing up for what's right is worth whatever price we have to pay." The next week, Miguel flew to Chicago to spend his spring break with his grandfather. James watched his 17-year-old grandson navigate the same moral terrain he had faced 2 years earlier, wrestling with the same questions about duty and safety, justice, and self-preservation. But Miguel had an advantage James hadn't possessed. He had an example of courage rewarded, a story of truth triumphant over power, a grandfather who could guide him through the process of speaking up without speaking out of turn. Together, they met with Elena Ramirez, who listened to Miguel's evidence with the same careful attention she had given to James and Maria. The case followed a familiar pattern, a trusted authority figure exploiting their position to steal from vulnerable people. In this case, students whose families had sacrificed to fund school improvements that enriched the principal instead of enhancing education. "You remind me of your grandfather," Elena told Miguel during their first meeting. "The same careful observation, the same attention to detail, the same moral clarity about right and wrong. That's not common, especially in someone your age. Your generation gives me hope that these battles won't always be so difficult." The investigation revealed that Principal David Morrison had stolen over $400,000 from various school accounts over 5 years, using the money to fund a lifestyle that included a luxury car, expensive vacations, and a boat docked at a marina where teachers' salaries couldn't afford slip fees. His methods were sophisticated, but not invisible. Fake vendor invoices, inflated repair bills, phantom consulting contracts that existed only to transfer money from school accounts to his personal finances. Miguel's testimony, delivered with the same quiet dignity that characterized his grandfather, proved decisive. The student who had trusted his education to adults who were supposed to protect his interests instead found himself protecting those interests from the adults who were supposed to be trustworthy. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the courtroom when Morrison was sentenced to 12 years in prison for theft, fraud, and breach of public trust. The Reynolds family, the judge observed during sentencing, has given this community a powerful reminder that integrity is inherited not through genetics, but through example. When good people stand up for what's right, they inspire others to do the same. This case began with a teenager who learned from his grandfather that some wrongs demand witnesses brave enough to speak truth to power. James watched his grandson accept congratulations from prosecutors, investigators, and fellow students whose educational opportunities had been restored by his courage. The pride he felt wasn't just personal, it was existential, the satisfaction that comes from knowing that principles survive through generations, that examples of integrity create more examples of integrity, that justice spreads like ripples through communities when ordinary people decide that extraordinary courage is simply ordinary responsibility. The three cases, James exposing the building management conspiracy, Maria revealing the law firm's theft from clients, Miguel uncovering the principal's embezzlement, became symbols of something larger than individual victories. They represented a shift in understanding about who possesses the power to challenge corruption, who has standing to demand accountability, who deserves protection when they risk everything to protect others. Elena Ramirez, whose practice had evolved from representing individual victims to coordinating a network of whistleblower cases, often spoke about the pattern she observed. Corruption thrives in the shadows where powerful people believe they're not being watched, she told audiences at legal conferences and community meetings. But service workers, students, ordinary citizens who pay attention, they see everything. When they find the courage to speak and the support to sustain their voices, even the most sophisticated criminal enterprises collapse. The Reynolds family's story spread beyond Chicago, inspiring similar cases across the country. In Detroit, a hospital janitor exposed doctors who were performing unnecessary surgeries to maximize insurance payments. In Phoenix, a school custodian revealed administrators who were selling donated supplies designed for low-income families. In Seattle, a hotel housekeeper uncovered a money laundering operation disguised as a hospitality business. Each case followed the template James had established: careful observation by invisible workers, methodical documentation of suspicious patterns, courage to speak despite personal risk, legal representation that understood the challenges faced by ordinary people challenging powerful institutions. The precedents created by these victories made subsequent cases easier to prosecute and more likely to succeed. But perhaps the most meaningful impact of James's decision couldn't be measured in court victories or prison sentences. It lived in the changed relationships between service workers and the people they served, in the increased awareness that every job deserves dignity, every person deserves respect, every wrong deserves a witness willing to speak up when it matters. The Meridian Tower, where James continued his work as head of security, became a model for how buildings could operate when transparency replaced secrecy, when service workers were treated as partners rather than servants, when residents understood that their security depended on the integrity of everyone who worked to maintain their comfortable lives. Mrs. Pemberton, the pharmaceutical heiress who had once barely acknowledged James's existence, now served on the board of the Legal Defense Fund that assisted other service workers facing retaliation for reporting wrongdoing. Timothy Blackwood, the hedge fund manager whose Bitcoin fortune had insulated him from concern about ordinary people's struggles, established a scholarship program for children of service workers who wanted to attend college but lacked the resources to pay tuition. James taught us something we should have known all along, Mrs. Pemberton said during a fundraising event for the Legal Defense Fund. The people who clean our offices, guard our buildings, serve our meals, they're not invisible. They see everything we do. They know everything we think we're hiding. When we treat them with respect and fairness, they protect us. When we exploit and dismiss them, they have the power to hold us accountable. It's not charity, it's justice, and it's long overdue. The fund grew rapidly, supported by wealthy residents who had learned that their own security depended on the integrity of the system that sustained their comfort. But the majority of contributions came from service workers themselves, small donations from people who understood that collective action provided protection that individual courage alone could not guarantee. James often marveled at this transformation, at how his personal decision to speak truth despite personal risk had created a movement that extended far beyond anything he had imagined. But he also understood that the change reflected deeper truths about power and dignity, about the interconnectedness of justice and security, about the way moral courage spreads through communities when ordinary people decide that extraordinary situations demand extraordinary responses. On quiet Sunday evenings, when the Meridian Tower lobby stood empty and the elevator banks hummed with subtle electrical music, James would sometimes walk through the marble halls where his journey had begun. The building looked the same, crystal chandeliers casting rainbow fragments across imported stone walls, expensive furniture arranged with architectural precision, the scent of fresh orchids mingling with the aroma of polished leather. But everything had changed. The residents who nodded to him now saw a human being rather than a function, a guardian whose vigilance protected them rather than a servant whose labor they took for granted. The management company operated with transparency and accountability, knowing that their actions were observed by someone with both the knowledge to understand their significance and the courage to report wrongdoing when it occurred. Most importantly, the invisible workers throughout the building, the cleaning crew, the maintenance staff, the security guards who worked the overnight shifts, understood that they possessed power they had never been taught to recognize. They were not victims waiting for rescue, but guardians whose observations and integrity provided the foundation for everyone's security. When they spoke, people listened. When they acted, things changed. The notebook where James recorded his daily observations had grown from a single volume to a small library of journals documenting the ongoing transformation. Positive changes had replaced negative patterns. Collaborative relationships had replaced exploitative arrangements. Trust had replaced suspicion because trust had been earned through accountable behavior rather than demanded through superior position. Every job has dignity, James continued to tell the younger workers who joined the building staff. Every person deserves respect. Every wrong deserves a witness willing to speak up when it matters. But now you know something I didn't know when I started. Speaking up works. Truth wins. Justice prevails when ordinary people possess extraordinary courage. The story of James Reynolds, invisible concierge turned visible guardian, had become something larger than one man's personal victory. It had become proof that democracy functions when citizens actively participate in holding power accountable, that justice emerges when ordinary people refuse to accept extraordinary injustice, that dignity belongs to everyone regardless of their position in social or economic hierarchies. As winter deepened over Chicago, painting the lake in shades of silver and coal, James Reynolds continued his daily routine with the profound satisfaction that comes from living according to principles that had been tested and validated. The morning commute on the Red Line carried him through neighborhoods where other invisible workers continued their crucial labors. But now those workers possessed something they hadn't had before: the knowledge that their voices mattered, their observations had value, their courage could change everything. And you, listening to this story wherever you are, perhaps in your own uniform, perhaps completing your own invisible labor, perhaps wrestling with your own knowledge of wrongdoing that powerful people hope you'll keep secret. You understand now that invisibility isn't powerlessness. You know that careful observation creates evidence, that truthful testimony changes outcomes, that moral courage spreads through communities when ordinary people decide that extraordinary situations demand extraordinary responses. The wages of courage, as James Reynolds discovered, extend far beyond personal vindication. They create precedents that protect others, establish networks that sustain future battles, and demonstrate that justice doesn't require expensive suits or impressive titles. Truth doesn't depend on stock portfolios or cryptocurrency investments. Integrity can't be purchased with real estate empires or inherited through family wealth. Sometimes the most important battles are fought by people whose daily labor seems invisible, whose patient observations reveal patterns that trained experts miss, whose truthful testimony can topple conspiracies that seemed untouchable. James Reynolds proved that invisible people possess extraordinary power when they find the courage to use their voices and the support to sustain their testimony. If this story touched something in your heart, if you recognized yourself in James's daily struggles or found hope in his ultimate vindication, please leave a like and subscribe so it reaches other invisible workers who deserve to know that their voices matter, their observations have value, their courage can change everything. Share it with someone who needs to hear that dignity doesn't depend on salary, that respect can be earned through character, that justice sometimes emerges from the most unexpected places. For more stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things, about the quiet heroes whose daily labor holds our communities together, about the invisible workers whose courage occasionally changes everything. Click the podcast link and join us for conversations that honor the dignity of honest work and the power of truthful testimony. Thank you for walking this journey with James Reynolds, for understanding that every building, every office, every institution depends on invisible people whose observations and integrity protect us all from those who would exploit their power for personal gain. We'll see you in the next story, where another unlikely hero reminds us that character matters more than capital, that truth outlasts wealth, and that sometimes the most powerful voices belong to people whom power tried to silence.